Zacharias Moussaoui. In August of 2001, an instructor at a flight school in Eagan, Minnesota, picked up the phone and called the FBI because one of his students had shown no interest in learning how to take off or how to land. The man he reported was arrested days later on an immigration violation, and he was sitting in a county cell when the towers came down. He remains the only person ever convicted in an American civilian courtroom for a role in the September 11th attacks. The judge who sentenced him took the trouble to describe out loud, in open court, exactly how his life would end. Zacharias Moussaoui was born on May 30, 1968, in Saint-Jean-de-Luz, on the French Atlantic coast, to Moroccan parents. His mother and father separated, and he was raised largely by his mother, Aïcha El Wafi. He would later testify at his own trial about the racism he faced growing up as the son of immigrants in France. None of it slowed him academically. He finished a master's degree in international business at South Bank University in London in 1995. It was in London that he changed. He began attending the Brixton Mosque, where the leadership eventually pushed him out after he kept pressing the clerics on how a man might go and join the jihad, and after he started turning up to prayers in combat fatigues. He drifted north to the Finsbury Park Mosque, a building run at the time by a preacher whose own case appears later in this list. By 1998, Moussaoui was in Afghanistan, training at a camp called Kaldon. 3 years after that, he was in Minnesota, paying for lessons on a commercial jet simulator. On August 16, 2001, federal agents arrested him on the immigration violation. The Minneapolis field office spent the following weeks asking headquarters for authority to search the laptop he had been carrying. They never got it. 26 days after the arrest, 4 aircraft were turned into weapons over New York, Virginia, and a field in Pennsylvania. In December of 2001, a grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia indicted him on 6 felony conspiracy counts, among them conspiring to take the lives of American citizens as part of the September 11th plot. The case took more than 3 years to reach any resolution. Then, in April of 2005, he stood up and pleaded guilty to all of it. That left a single question for a jury to answer. Should he be sentenced to death or locked in a cell for the rest of his natural life? The penalty phase ran through the spring of 2006, and it turned into an argument about how much he had actually known. Prosecutors said that if he had told the truth to the agents who arrested him in August, the attacks could have been disrupted. The defense put his upbringing in front of the jury, along with the argument that he had been on the edge of the plot rather than inside it. The jury declined to impose death. Jurors afterward pointed to the instability of his childhood and to the real possibility that he had never been told the specifics of what was coming. On May 4, 2006, United States District Judge Leonie Brinkema imposed 6 consecutive life terms with no possibility of release. Moussaoui had walked into the courtroom that morning announcing that he had won. Brinkema told him he had lost, that he would never get the martyrdom he came looking for, that there would be no great explosion of glory waiting for him at the end. He would go out quietly, in a concrete room, with nobody listening. She ordered the marshals to take him away. 4 days later, he tried to withdraw the guilty plea. Brinkema refused. His appeal to the Fourth Circuit went nowhere, and both the conviction and the sentence stood. Parole was never available to him, and it never will be. Congress abolished federal parole in the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984, and the change took effect on November 1st, 1987. Every federal sentence handed down after that date runs to its end. A life term means the whole of a life. On the night of May 12, 2006, he was flown out of Alexandria, Virginia, and he arrived at the Administrative Maximum Facility outside Florence, Colorado, in the early hours of Saturday morning. The routine there has not varied much in the 20 years since. Roughly 23 hours a day inside a single cell, meals through a slot in the door, 1 hour out. In 2018, he filed a federal lawsuit describing that isolation as a form of psychological torture and asking a court to loosen it. The filing did not change his conditions. As of 2026, Zacharias Musausi is 57 years old and still confined at ADX Florence. His continued imprisonment there is the best documented of any man on this list. Brinkema sentenced him for a plot he helped talk about but never carried out. The same facility already held a man who had done considerably more than talk about attacking the World Trade Center. He built the device himself, drove it into the basement, and lit it 8 years before the towers came down. Ramzi Ahmed Youssef. Just after midday on February 26, 1993, a yellow rental van rolled down the ramp into the parking levels beneath the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The man who parked it lit the fuse, got into a waiting car, and was out of the country before the smoke had cleared the ramps. The name he had been traveling under was not his own, and the uncle he had been working alongside would go on to plan the attack that finished what he started. Ramzi Youssef is an alias. The September 11th Commission concluded that the man behind it was almost certainly born Abdul Basit Mahmoud Abdul Karim in Kuwait, to a family with Baloch and Pakistani roots. Even his birth date is contested. Some records give April 27, 1968. Others give May 20, 1967. What is not contested is the family connection. His mother's brother was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the man who would later design the September 11th operation. He studied electrical engineering in Wales and graduated around 1990. He then went to a camp near Peshawar and learned to build bombs. He entered the United States in September of 1992 on a passport he had no right to be carrying, claimed asylum at Kennedy Airport, and was released to await a hearing he never bothered to attend. Within weeks, he had made contact with the cleric Omar Abdel Rahman, known to his followers as the Blind Sheikh. The device he assembled over the following months weighed 1,336 pounds. Urea nitrate, packed into the back of the van. It went off just after 12:15 in the afternoon, tore a crater several stories deep through the parking structure, and pushed smoke up through both towers. Thousands of office workers spent the afternoon feeling their way down unlit stairwells. 6 people lost their lives. 1,042 were injured. They were John DiGiovanni, Robert Kirkpatrick, Stephen Knapp, William Macco, Wilfredo Mercado, and Monica Rodriguez Smith. Smith was pregnant, and she was due to begin her maternity leave the following day. Their names are cut into the bronze at the September 11th memorial, on the panel set aside for the 1993 attack. Youssef was on a flight to Pakistan that night, and he did not stop working. In December of 1994, he placed a small device beneath a seat aboard Philippine Airlines Flight 434, and a Japanese passenger named Haruki Ikegami lost his life when it went off. That was a rehearsal. The plan behind it, which investigators came to call Bojinka, would have brought down roughly a dozen American airliners over the Pacific on a single day. A chemical fire in a Manila apartment in January of 1995 exposed the whole thing before it could run. The notes recovered from that apartment described a second half to the plan, in which an aircraft would be flown into the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency. He stayed free for 2 years. On February 7, 1995, Pakistani intelligence officers working alongside the American Diplomatic Security Service arrested him in Islamabad. What does a court do with a man who was still building devices 2 years after his first one went off? He was tried 3 separate times in the Southern District of New York, all 3 before Judge Kevin Thomas Duffy. On September 5, 1996, a jury convicted him in the airline plot case. On November 12, 1997, a second jury convicted him for the World Trade Center bombing. Sentencing came on January 8, 1998. Duffy handed down life plus 240 years, called him an apostle of evil, and recommended that he be held in solitary confinement for the remainder of it. Youssef was given the chance to speak. He told the court plainly that he was a terrorist, that he was proud of being one, and that he supported terrorism for as long as it was aimed at the American government and at Israel. Duffy's recommendation was followed to the letter. The Second Circuit affirmed both convictions on April 4, 2003. Like Moussaoui, he had no parole to apply for and never has. He has been at ADX Florence since January of 1998. Since 1997, he has been held under special administrative measures, the federal restrictions that cut a prisoner off from contact with other inmates and narrow his permitted contact, in practice, to his own attorney. His cell measures roughly 7 feet by 11. A bunk, a desk, a stool, a toilet, a shower on a timer, and a small television. In 2013, his lawyer, Bernard Kleinman, went to court to challenge the restrictions. They remain in place. For a period, he was housed on the range that staff and reporters came to call Bombers Row, a few doors from Timothy McVeigh. By several accounts, he spent that time trying, without any success at all, to convert McVeigh to Islam. Bombers Row is not an official designation. The Bureau of Prisons has never used the term for anything. As of 2026, he is 58 years old and still held at ADX Florence. Youssef built his device over months, in rented rooms, with chemicals bought a drum at a time. Richard Reed needed no truck and no garage at all. He walked everything he required straight onto the aircraft, in his shoes. Richard Colvin Reed. Every time you take your shoes off in an airport security line, you are following a rule written by one man on a single afternoon 3 days before Christmas. He was aboard a transatlantic flight when a flight attendant walked past his row and caught the smell of a struck match. There were 197 people on that aircraft. What she did in the next few seconds decided whether any of them reached Miami. Richard Colvin Reed was born on August 12, 1973, in Bromley, on the southeastern edge of London. His early record is petty and unremarkable. Street robberies, short sentences, time in a young offenders institution. He converted to Islam while inside. On release, he began attending the Brixton Mosque, the same congregation that had already asked Moussaoui to leave. And when Brixton proved too moderate for him, he moved on to Finsbury Park. By the late 1990s, he was in Afghanistan, training in al-Qaeda camps. He was not an obvious recruit for anything. His father had been in and out of prison for most of his childhood, and his own convictions were the ordinary kind that fill a magistrate's court on any given morning. What the mosques offered him, and what the camps offered afterward, was the first thing anyone had ever asked him to be serious about. On December 22, 2001, just over 3 months after the September 11th attacks, he boarded American Airlines Flight 63 at Charles de Gaulle in Paris, bound for Miami. 185 passengers, 12 crew. Built into the soles of his shoes were plastic explosives, with triacetone triperoxide as the trigger. Somewhere over the Atlantic, he tried to light the fuse. A flight attendant named Hermès Moutardier smelled the match and challenged him. He shoved her away. She and a colleague raised the alarm, and passengers came over the seats at him. He was pinned down, tied into place with belts, and sedated by two doctors who happened to be aboard. The aircraft diverted to Boston, and FBI agents took him off it the moment the doors opened at Logan. The explosive was later examined in a laboratory and found to be entirely viable. Investigators concluded that if he had managed to get the fuse to take, the charge in his shoe would have been enough to open the fuselage over open water. How does a court sentence a man who tells it, without any hesitation at all, that he considers himself at war with the country trying him? Reed was charged in federal court in Boston with 8 terrorism counts, among them attempted use of a weapon of mass destruction, attempted destruction of an aircraft, and interference with a flight crew. He pleaded not guilty in January of 2002 and spent 9 months in a cell in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Then he changed his position entirely. On October 4, 2002, he pleaded guilty to every count and told the court he had no defense to offer and did not want one. The sentencing hearing on January 30, 2003, became one of the more widely quoted proceedings in modern American terrorism law. Reed told the court that he was at war with the United States, that he had pledged allegiance to Osama bin Laden, and that he would not be apologizing for anything he had done. United States District Judge William Young answered him directly. He told Reed that he was not an enemy combatant and not a soldier in any army, that he was a terrorist and nothing grander than that, and that the court was not afraid of him. Then he imposed 3 consecutive life terms, plus 110 years. Young went further than sentencing judges usually do. He told Reed that the flag hanging behind the bench would still be flying in that courtroom long after his name had been forgotten, and that the sentence coming down on him was not being handed out by an army or by a government in secret, but by an ordinary court in public under a jury system Reed had spent his adult life rejecting. Then he ordered the marshals to take him out. The sentence has never been disturbed, and no parole mechanism exists that could reach it. He was moved to ADX Florence in 2003 and has been there ever since, under the same regime as the men in the cells around him. In 2015, he released a letter from inside, reflecting on where his life had ended up. He has never publicly withdrawn a word of what he said in Judge Young's courtroom. He lives under the same restrictions as the men in the cells on either side of him. His mail is read before it leaves the building, and his calls are counted. That letter in 2015 was one of the very few times his voice reached the outside at all. As of 2026, Richard Reed is 52 years old and still held at ADX Florence. The screening rule his attempt created is still in force in airports on every continent. Reed's device caught fire but never detonated. The network that trained him spent the next 8 years working on that failure, and their answer was to move the explosive off the feet and onto the body, and to send a man no watch list had ever stopped, Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib. In November of 2009, one of the most prominent bankers in Nigeria walked into an American embassy and told officials that his own son had been radicalized and had disappeared into Yemen. It is difficult to think of a clearer warning a family member has ever handed a government before an attack. The name went into a broad terrorism database and no further, and it never reached a no-fly list. 5 weeks later, that son was strapped into a seat on a Christmas Day flight into Detroit. Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib was born on December 22, 1986, in Lagos, the youngest of 16 children. His father, Alhaji Umaru Muttalib, had chaired First Bank of Nigeria and would later chair Jaiz Bank, the country's first Islamic bank. The son was educated at the British School of Loam in Togo Then, at University College London, where he read engineering, served as president of the university's Islamic Society, and graduated in 2008. Friends from his London years later described a student who prayed constantly, kept largely to himself, and posted long and lonely messages on an Islamic web forum about the distance between what he believed and how he was actually living. Then he went to Yemen. There he came under the direction of Anwar al-Awlaki, the American-born cleric who had become the most effective English-language recruiter al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula ever produced. By later accounts, al-Awlaki gave the operation its final approval. He died in an American drone strike in September of 2011. On Christmas Day, 2009, Abdul Muttalib boarded Northwest Airlines Flight 253 from Amsterdam to Detroit, with about 290 people aboard. Sewn into his underwear was a quantity of PETN, a high explosive that no metal detector at Schiphol was built to find. As the aircraft began its descent, he went to the lavatory, came back to his seat, covered himself with a blanket, and tried to set the device off. It caught fire rather than exploding. Passengers heard the pop, saw flame climbing the seat back, and came over the rows at him. Crew emptied extinguishers into it. He was badly burned, and he was pulled to the front of the cabin as the aircraft landed at Detroit Metropolitan Airport. He was taken off under guard and treated for those burns before he saw the inside of a courtroom. In the first hours of questioning, he spoke freely to FBI agents about Yemen and about who had sent him, and then he stopped talking. The decision to handle him as a criminal defendant rather than as a battlefield captive turned into a political argument in Washington that outlasted the prosecution itself. What does a courtroom do with a defendant who refuses to contest a single piece of evidence against him and then treats his own sentencing as a stage? He dismissed his court-appointed lawyers early and insisted on conducting his own defense, with a standby attorney seated beside him to handle procedure. He filed motions in his own hand. His position, stated openly in those filings, was that the device had been a legitimate act of war. Then the trial had barely begun when it ended. On October 12, 2011, Abdul Muttalib surprised the court by pleading guilty to all 8 counts. They included conspiracy to commit an act of terrorism, attempted use of a weapon of mass destruction, and the attempted taking of 289 lives. Sentencing came on February 16, 2012 in Detroit, before United States District Judge Nancy Edmonds. Abdul Muttalib told the court that he was proud of what he had tried to do and that he had acted in the name of God. Edmonds put on the record that in the more than 2 years since the attempt, he had never once expressed doubt or remorse. Several passengers from Flight 253 had flown to Detroit to address the court before she ruled. She imposed 4 consecutive life terms plus 50 years, and none of them carried a release date. He was moved to ADX Florence in March of 2012 and placed immediately under special administrative measures that cut him off, for years, from contact with most of his own family. In 2017, he sued the Attorney General and the Bureau of Prisons, alleging that he had been denied a halal diet and regular access to an imam, that he had been force-fed during hunger strikes, and that guards belittled him. The litigation ran on for years without changing the substance of his confinement. The attempt reshaped air travel as thoroughly as Reed's had. Within a year, full-body scanners were being installed across American and European terminals, and the watch-listing system that had absorbed his father's warning and done nothing with it was rebuilt around a much lower threshold for stopping a passenger at the gate. As of 2026, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib is 39 years old and still at ADX Florence, the youngest man held on that range. Abdul Muttalib took his instruction from a cleric he met in a house in Yemen and heard through a laptop speaker. Two of the men already named here took theirs standing in a room in North London, from a preacher who would spend 8 years fighting to stay out of an American courtroom. Mostafa Kamal Mostafa. For most of the 2000s, a single mosque in North London was the most closely watched building in British counter-terrorism, and the man at its pulpit knew exactly how closely. Two of the men now serving life sentences in Colorado had sat in his congregation. It took American prosecutors 8 years of legal filings to pry him out of Britain. And when they finally managed it, the case they brought against him reached back to a kidnapping in the Yemeni desert and a piece of empty land in rural Oregon. Mostafa Kamal Mostafa, known almost everywhere as Abu Hamza al-Masri, was born on April 15, 1958, in Alexandria, Egypt. He arrived in Britain in 1979 on a student visa and studied civil engineering at Brighton Polytechnic. He lost both hands and the sight in one eye at some point in the 1990s, injuries he has attributed to an explosion. The British tabloids built a nickname around the prosthetic hooks he wore afterward, and it followed him into every headline printed about him for the next 20 years. By the mid-1990s, he had the pulpit at the Finsbury Park Mosque. What he preached there drew young men from across Britain and Europe, and the roster of people who passed through that building is the reason his name keeps surfacing in other men's case files. Zacharias Moussaoui attended. So did Richard Reed. British authorities barred him from the building in 2003 and raided it. He moved his sermons onto the pavement outside, held them there week after week in front of crowds that sometimes ran into the hundreds, and carried on for another year with police officers filming him from across the road. In 2006, a British court convicted him of inciting violence and racial hatred and sentenced him to 7 years. The United States had already asked for him. He fought extradition through every level of the British and European court system and lost at each one. The final stop was the European Court of Human Rights, which in 2012 took up the precise question his American lawyers would raise again later: whether sending a man to a supermax prison in Colorado would amount to inhuman or degrading treatment. The court held that it would not. In October of 2012, he was put on an aircraft to New York. The indictment covered 3 separate matters. In 1998, kidnappers in Yemen seized a group of Western tourists, and 4 of them lost their lives during the rescue attempt that followed. Prosecutors said Mostafa had supplied the satellite phone the kidnappers used to coordinate. Second, he had conspired to establish a training camp on rural property in Bly, Oregon. Third, in 2000, he had dispatched a follower to an al-Qaeda camp in Afghanistan. How much of what a preacher says from a pulpit is speech, and where precisely does it stop being speech and become a crime? He had spent years telling anyone who asked that he was a preacher and not a soldier, and that the men who left his congregation for Afghanistan had made their own decisions. The government's case was that he had made those decisions considerably easier to reach. That question sat at the center of a 4-week jury trial in Manhattan. The defense argued he had been a loud and offensive orator and nothing beyond that. The government put the satellite phone records in front of the jury, along with witnesses connected to the Oregon property and testimony about the man sent to Afghanistan. On May 19, 2014, the jury convicted him on all 11 counts. He was sentenced on January 9, 2015, by United States District Judge Catherine Forrest to life in prison with no possibility of release. Preet Bharara, the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, said afterward that the journey from cleric to convict, from imam to inmate, was now complete. The Second Circuit upheld both the conviction and the sentence. His lawyers had argued that the terms of his extradition from Britain barred the American government from holding him in a supermax facility. The appeals court found that no such condition existed anywhere in the agreement. He has been at ADX Florence since 2015, and he has spent a great deal of that time in litigation over how he is held there. His filings have alleged assault by staff, denial of accommodations for his faith, and the withholding of hygiene items that a man without hands cannot manage alone. His attorneys have described recurring infections in his arm stumps. In January of 2024, Chief United States District Judge Philip Brimmer narrowed the case substantially, allowing only limited religious freedom claims to proceed. His wife and sons have petitioned repeatedly for his return to a British prison. No transfer has been granted. As of 2026, Mostafa Kamal Mostafa is 68 years old, still at ADX Florence, and still filing over the conditions of his confinement. Every man named so far was born outside the United States and was brought into it to answer for what he did. The one who follows was born in Michigan, wore an American uniform, and helped build the deadliest device ever set off on American soil by an American. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Terry Lynn Nichols. On the morning of April 19, 1995, a rented truck sat at the curb outside a federal building in downtown Oklahoma City, and the man who had helped fill it was at his house in Kansas, hundreds of miles away. He never went near the building. He would still be convicted on 161 counts in an Oklahoma courtroom, and the judge who sentenced him would describe him as responsible for more deaths than any other person in American history. Terry Lynn Nichols was born on April 1, 1955, in Lapeer, Michigan. He served in the United States Army, which is where he met Timothy McVeigh. Both men drifted into the anti-government militia, thinking that spread through parts of the country in the early 1990s, hardened by the federal sieges at Ruby Ridge and Waco. Nichols was the quieter of the two. He bought materials, moved them, and kept them in rented storage lockers under names that were not his. What the two of them assembled weighed roughly 5,000 pounds. Ammonium nitrate fertilizer mixed with fuel oil, packed into barrels in the back of a rented truck. At 9:02 on that Wednesday morning, it went off directly outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. The front third of the structure came down. 168 people lost their lives, and roughly 680 more were injured. 5 of the dead worked for the Drug Enforcement Administration. 19 were children, most of them in a daycare center on the second floor, which sat almost directly above where the truck had been parked. It remains the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in the history of the United States. Among the families left behind was Jannie Coverdale, who lost 2 young grandsons that morning. She has spoken publicly about the case for 3 decades, and she has said more than once that she forgave Terry Nichols. The site is now the Oklahoma City National Memorial. 168 empty bronze and stone chairs stand on the footprint of the building, set out in 9 rows for the 9 floors, and 19 of those chairs are smaller than the others. Nichols was already in custody within days. His wife, Marie Foy, later testified that he had been living what amounted to a double life, using aliases and keeping caches of material she knew nothing about. If a man never touched the truck and never came within 200 miles of the building, how much of the outcome belongs to him? 2 juries answered that question in 2 different courtrooms 7 years apart. Timothy McVeigh had been tried first, convicted in 1997, and put to death by the federal government in June of 2001. Nichols was always going to be tried separately, and he was going to be tried twice. The federal case came first. On December 24, 1997, a jury convicted Nichols of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction and of 8 counts of involuntary manslaughter, one for each federal law enforcement officer who had been in the building. The same jury deadlocked on whether he should be sentenced to death. On June 4, 1998, United States District Judge Richard Match imposed life without the possibility of release and called him an enemy of the Constitution. The federal indictment could only reach 8 of the dead because the statutes the government charged under protected federal law enforcement officers and the rest of the people in that building were not federal officers. That gap is the reason Oklahoma spent years and a great deal of money putting him in front of a second jury. The state tried him for everyone else. The state trial ran in McAllister, and on May 26, 2004, a jury convicted him on 161 counts of first-degree homicide, including a single count of fetal homicide, along with first-degree arson and conspiracy. That jury also deadlocked on the death penalty. District Judge Stephen Taylor imposed 161 consecutive life terms, each of them without parole. At the state sentencing, Nichols spoke to a court for the first time. He asked the victims and the survivors for forgiveness and told them his heart went out to them. It was the only public statement of remorse he has ever made. There is nothing left for him to appeal to and nothing left to apply for. His federal sentence falls under the same abolition of parole that binds every man in this story, and Oklahoma imposed its 161 terms without parole as well. He was sent to ADX Florence directly after the federal sentencing in 1998 and has been in solitary confinement there ever since. His litigation from inside has been limited and mundane, mostly disputes over his prison diet, arguing for food that met both his religious observance and his health needs. As of 2026, Terry Lynn Nichols is 71 years old and still at ADX Florence, the oldest man held there for a terrorism offense. Nichols and McVeigh had convinced themselves the federal government was an occupying force. A little over a year after the truck went off in Oklahoma City, another former American soldier arrived at a version of the same conclusion by an entirely different road, and he carried his devices into crowds one at a time, on foot. Eric Robert Rudolph. In the early hours of a July morning in 1996, a man walked to a payphone in downtown Atlanta and called 911 to warn that a device had been left in Centennial Olympic Park. The warning was accurate. It simply did not reach the officers standing in that park in time. He then disappeared into the mountains of western North Carolina and stayed there for more than 5 years, while the FBI put him on its 10 most wanted list and searched the woods around him. Eric Robert Rudolph was born on September 19, 1966, in Merritt Island, Florida. He spent time in the United States Army and made his living afterward as a carpenter. His politics were built around opposition to abortion and hostility toward gay people, and around a belief that the American government had forfeited any moral authority the day it legalized abortion. He was competent in the woods, patient, and almost entirely uninterested in being understood. He set off 4 devices in 18 months. The first was in Centennial Olympic Park at around 1:20 in the morning on July 27, 1996, in the middle of the Olympic Games. He had packed pipe bombs and masonry nails into a military backpack and left it beside a sound tower in a crowd of thousands. 1 woman lost her life, and 111 people were injured. The second came on January 16, 1997, at an abortion clinic in Sandy Springs, north of Atlanta. Rudolph used 2 devices there, the second time to go off after emergency crews had already arrived. The third was at the Other Side Lounge, a lesbian bar in Atlanta, on February 21, 1997. The fourth was the worst. On January 29, 1998, he hid a remote detonated device in shrubbery outside the New Woman All-Women Clinic in Birmingham, Alabama, and watched from across the road until he could set it off by hand. The woman who lost her life in Atlanta was Alice Hawthorne, 44, a mother and business owner from Albany, Georgia, who had driven up to see the games. Her daughter was standing beside her and was injured in the same blast. A Turkish cameraman named Melih Uzunol died of a heart attack while running toward the scene to film it. In Birmingham, off-duty police officer Robert Sanderson, 35, lost his life, and the clinic's head nurse, Emily Lyons, survived with the loss of sight in one eye and dozens of operations ahead of her. Rudolph's 5 years in the wilderness ended in the least dramatic way imaginable. On May 31, 2003, a rookie officer named Jeff Postel spotted a man behind a grocery store in Murphy, North Carolina, scavenging for food in the small hours, and arrested him without knowing who he had. He had lived through 5 winters in those mountains on stolen grain, salvaged vegetables, and food taken out of bins behind restaurants. He told investigators afterward that he had spent stretches of that time camped within a few miles of the teams searching for him. So what does the government do with a defendant who wants a trial, wants the platform, and has 4 separate capital-eligible cases waiting for him? It takes the death penalty off the table in exchange for certainty. In April of 2005, Rudolph pleaded guilty to all 4 bombings under an agreement that spared his life and required him to lead investigators to buried caches of explosives he had left in the North Carolina hills. He also released an 11-page written statement justifying every one of the attacks with biblical citations. The agreement closed all 4 cases across 2 federal districts at once, and it meant that none of the people he had injured would have to sit through a trial and be cross-examined about it. Federal teams spent several weeks that summer digging the caches out of the North Carolina hills. The Birmingham sentencing came first, on July 18, 2005, before United States District Judge C. Linwood Smith. Rudolph received 2 consecutive life terms with no route to release, plus restitution of $1,276.43. In August, an Atlanta court added further life terms and 120 years on top. He was not repentant in either courtroom. He told the hearing that abortion had to be fought with deadly force. Diane Derzis, who ran the Birmingham clinic, told him she took great delight in the thought of him spending the rest of his life in a box roughly 8 feet by 12. Alice Hawthorne's daughter, by then a grown woman, stood up and told him she forgave him. His plea agreement contained a waiver of his right to appeal. He later tried to challenge the convictions anyway, and the matter reached the 11th Circuit, where the waiver he had signed stood in his way. Nothing about his sentence has moved since. He arrived at ADX Florence in August of 2005. As of 2026, Eric Robert Rudolph is 59 years old and still confined at ADX Florence. Rudolph wanted his reasoning on the record so badly that he typed it out and handed it to the court in 11 pages. The man who follows him had spent his entire career doing that job for somebody else, on camera, sitting beside the most wanted man in the world, Sulaiman Abu Ghaith. In the days after the September 11th attacks, a video went out to the world showing 3 men seated against a rock face somewhere in Afghanistan. 2 of them are the most recognizable faces in the history of Al-Qaeda. The third did most of the talking, and 12 years later, he became the highest-ranking figure that organization has ever sent to trial on American soil. Sulaiman Abu Ghaith, was born on December 14, 1965, in Kuwait. He grew up around the Muslim Brotherhood, trained as a teacher, and became an imam, leading prayers at a mosque in the Salmiya district. He first came to public attention during the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait in 1990 and 1991, when his sermons drew large crowds. In June of 2000, he left for Afghanistan and joined al-Qaeda. In the weeks after the attacks, he recorded a series of statements warning Americans and their allies that the storm of aircraft was not going to stop, and telling Muslims not to fly and not to live in tall buildings. Those recordings became the spine of the evidence used against him 12 years later. He had become the organization's principal spokesman. He appeared in recruitment videos alongside Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, praising what had been done and promising more of it. He also married into the family. His wife was Fatima bin Laden, the eldest of Osama bin Laden's daughters. In 2001, Kuwait revoked his citizenship, which left him stateless. He crossed into Iran late that year alongside a number of other al-Qaeda figures and members of the bin Laden family, and he remained there for roughly a decade under an arrangement somewhere between protection and house arrest that no government involved has ever fully explained. Eventually, he surfaced in Turkey. After bin Laden's death in May of 2011, the network around Abu Ghaith began to come apart. Turkey detained him and deported him. On February 28, 2013, American agents took custody of him in Amman, Jordan, and flew him to New York. He made his first appearance in a Manhattan courtroom on March 1st. That arrival landed in the middle of a live political argument. Members of Congress wrote to the Attorney General demanding that he be moved into military custody and tried by commission at Guantanamo Bay, arguing that a federal courthouse a few blocks from the site of the attacks was the wrong venue for a member of al-Qaeda's leadership. The Justice Department's answer was that the civilian courts had already handled every case of this kind put in front of them, including the ones that had produced the sentences now being served in Colorado. He stayed in the civilian system. Can a spokesman be held responsible for what the organization he speaks for goes on to do? That was the entire case. Abu Ghaith was tried in the Southern District of New York before Judge Lewis Kaplan on charges of conspiring to take the lives of American nationals, conspiring to provide material support to terrorists, and providing material support to terrorists. The trial ran about 3 weeks. He took the stand in his own defense and told the jury that his role had been religious, that he had been a preacher and not an operator, and that he had known nothing of what was planned before it happened. The recording in which he praised the attacks, he said, had been made at bin Laden's request, from material he had been handed, and he had understood himself to be leading prayers rather than holding a rank. On March 26, 2014, the jury convicted him on every count. Sentencing came on September 23, 2014. His lawyers asked for 15 years. Prosecutors described his speeches as inciting, hateful, and written to produce deaths. Kaplan said he had seen no remorse whatsoever in the man in front of him, and told him that in the court's assessment, he still wanted to do everything in his power to carry out al-Qaeda's agenda against Americans. He imposed a life sentence. Abu Ghaith answered in Arabic. He said he would not seek mercy from anyone but God, and he warned the judge that a sentence like this one would put hundreds of young Muslims in motion. Kaplan let him finish and closed the hearing. His appeal turned in part on what he had said to American agents during the long flight from Jordan to New York, which his lawyers argued should never have been put before a jury. The Second Circuit disagreed and upheld the conviction in 2017. There is no parole to seek and no sentence left to reduce. He was sent to ADX Florence, where he has been housed along the same range as Moussaoui, Youssef, and Reed, three men whose cases his own words helped to celebrate. Kuwait has never moved to restore his citizenship, and no other country has offered to take him. As of 2026, Sulaiman Abu Ghaith is 60 years old and still confined at ADX Florence. Abu Ghaith's weapon was the camera, and he used it after the fact to explain and to recruit. A decade later, a four-man cell operating in northern Syria turned the camera into the operation itself, and one of those four ended up in the same federal district that had convicted Moussaoui, El Shafi El Sheikh. Their hostages gave them a nickname because all four of them spoke with British accents. Four men from London, holding roughly 24 Westerners in a series of cells across northern Syria, and what they did there shaped what the world came to understand about the group they served. One of the four was captured in 2018 and convicted in a Virginia courtroom 4 years later. And almost every account you will read of where he is being held right now is wrong. El Shafi El Sheikh was born on July 16, 1988, in Omdurman, Sudan, and raised in Shepherd's Bush in West London. He traveled to Syria in 2012 and joined the Islamic State. The British government revoked his citizenship in 2018, which left him with no country prepared to claim him. The cell he joined had 4 members: Mohammed Emwazi, the one who appeared in the videos and who died in a drone strike in 2015, Alexander Kote, El Sheikh, and a fourth man, Aini Davis, who was picked up in Turkey and prosecuted there rather than in an American court. Britain stripped the citizenship of more than one of them, which is a large part of why the case against El Sheikh ended up in Virginia at all. Between 2012 and 2015, they held 26 Westerners, and the evidence presented at trial described a routine of restraint, mock executions, beatings, and organized humiliation that ran for months at a time. 4 of the captives were American. James Foley was a freelance conflict journalist and former teacher from New Hampshire, 40 years old, who had gone back to Syria after already surviving captivity in Libya. Stephen Sotloff was a journalist working the same conflict. Peter Kassig was a former United States Army Ranger who had left the military and set up a small operation delivering food and medical supplies to Syrian refugees. Kayla Muller was a humanitarian aid worker who was held separately and abused by the leader of the organization before her death was confirmed to her family in February of 2015. Foley's death was filmed and released in August of 2014. Sotloff's followed within weeks, Kassig's in November. British and Japanese captives were treated the same way. El Sheikh was captured in January of 2018 by the Syrian Democratic Forces as he tried to cross into Turkey. Before his trial, he had given a series of interviews to journalists in which he discussed the cell's work with a striking lack of caution. He gave them while in Kurdish custody, apparently believing they might help him. Prosecutors later played them to the jury as confessions. How do you build a case in an American courtroom about events that happened in a country no American investigator could safely enter? Largely on the survivors and on his own mouth. Prosecutors in the Eastern District of Virginia brought European hostages who had been released to testify in Alexandria, and they played his own recorded interviews back to the jury. The case was heard by Senior Judge T.S. Ellis III. As a condition of British cooperation with the investigation, the United States had agreed in advance not to seek the death penalty. On April 14, 2022, after roughly 4 hours of deliberation, the jury convicted him on all 8 counts, including 4 counts of hostage-taking resulting in death. He was sentenced on August 19, 2022, to 8 concurrent life terms with no possibility of release. The date was the 8th anniversary of the release of the video of James Foley's death. Ellis described his conduct as horrific, barbaric, brutal, and criminal. Elsheikh declined the opportunity to speak. Diane Foley, James Foley's mother, called the outcome a hollow victory, but said it proved that American justice will find you wherever you are. The Fourth Circuit upheld the convictions and the sentences on June 7, 2024, rejecting his argument that his media interviews and his statements to interrogators should have been kept out of the trial. Here is where the record diverges from what almost everyone believes. At his sentencing, Elsheikh's lawyers argued that he was showing signs of mental and physical deterioration and that a supermax placement would be inappropriate. The Bureau of Prisons did not send him to ADX Florence. He was placed instead at the United States Penitentiary at Florence High, a high-security prison on the same Colorado complex, a short distance from the supermax, where he lives in the general population rather than in solitary confinement. A prison source told British reporters in September of 2022 that none of the victims' families understood how he had avoided the supermax, and that it felt to them like a blow, because ADX is meant for the worst of the worst. His co-defendant, Alexander Cote, is serving his life sentence at a federal penitentiary in Waymart, Pennsylvania. As of 2026, El-Shafi El-Sheikh is 37 years old, serving 8 life sentences, and held at Florence High rather than inside the supermax that gives this list its name. El-Sheikh lost his citizenship by government order before he ever saw an American courtroom. The last man on this list had gone in precisely the opposite direction. He stood in a room in Connecticut, raised his right hand, and swore an oath to the United States 1 year and 2 weeks before he tried to set off a device in Times Square. Faisal Shahzad. On a Saturday evening in May of 2010, a street vendor working the theater crowd in Times Square noticed smoke coming from the back of a parked sport utility vehicle and flagged down a mounted police officer. Inside were propane tanks, gasoline canisters, fireworks, and fertilizer, wired together and left on one of the most crowded blocks in the country at the busiest hour of the week. The man who had parked it there was a naturalized American citizen with an MBA, and he had taken his oath of allegiance almost exactly 1 year earlier. Faisal Shahzad was born on June 30, 1979, in Karachi. His father, Air Vice Marshal Baharul Haq, was a senior officer in the Pakistan Air Force who went on to run the country's Civil Aviation Authority. The family was comfortable and secular. Shahzad moved to the United States in 1998, took a bachelor's degree in 2000 and an MBA in 2005, both from the University of Bridgeport in Connecticut, and went to work as a junior budget analyst. He became noticeably more religious around 2008 and 2009, at the same time as his finances came apart. On April 17, 2009, he was naturalized as a citizen of the United States. Within months, he was in Waziristan. In December of 2009, he trained with the Pakistani Taliban, and a co-conspirator handed him roughly $12,000 to $15,000 in 2 payments to fund what came next. He later told investigators that he had been listening to Anwar al-Awlaki's sermons online, the same voice that had directed Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib a few months before him, and that he was angry about American drone strikes in Pakistan. On May 1, 2010, he drove a Nissan Pathfinder into Times Square, parked it, set the timers, and walked away toward Grand Central. The device did not go off. It smoldered, and the smoke is what saved everybody. The bomb squad that took it apart found the build close to amateurish. The fertilizer he had bought was a grade that would not detonate. The fireworks were the kind sold over a counter. The valves on the propane tanks had never been opened. Had every component done what he expected it to do on that block at that hour, the consequences would have been severe. None of it worked the way he had planned. The investigation that followed was one of the fastest in modern federal history. Agents traced the vehicle identification number stamped into the engine block, which led them to a private seller who had advertised the vehicle on a classified site 3 weeks earlier and sold it for $1,300 in cash. The buyer had left a phone number. That number closed the gap between a smoldering truck and a suspect inside 2 days. Shahzad reached the no-fly list while he was already strapped into his seat aboard Emirates Flight 202 at Kennedy Airport. Cabin door closed, bound for Dubai. Customs officers had the aircraft brought back off the taxiway. He was taken into custody on May 3rd, a little over 53 hours after he had walked away from the vehicle. What does a court owe a man who tells it, on the record, that his oath of citizenship was a lie when he made it? Shahzad gave the government no fight at all. On June 21, 2010, 7 weeks after his arrest, he pleaded guilty to all 10 counts, among them attempted use of a weapon of mass destruction and conspiracy to commit an act of terrorism. He described himself to the court as a Muslim soldier and told the room to brace itself, because as he saw it, the war had only just started. He was sentenced on October 5, 2010, by United States District Judge Miriam Goldman Cedarbaum. The statute left her no room to move. Attempted use of a weapon of mass destruction carries a mandatory life sentence, and she imposed it, noting for the record that he had shown no remorse of any kind. Then she asked him whether he had sworn allegiance to the United States at his naturalization ceremony the previous year. He answered that he had sworn it, but that he had not meant it. She told him he had taken a false oath, and that was the end of the hearing. He had used his own time at the microphone to tell the court that he expected to see the defeat of the United States, and that the men who followed him would not repeat his mistakes. He did not appeal. There is no parole for him to seek and no mechanism that could shorten a mandatory life term. He was transferred to ADX Florence, and he has been in a cell in southern Colorado ever since. As of 2026, Faisal Shahzad is 46 years old and still held at ADX Florence, one of the small number of naturalized American citizens serving a terrorism sentence inside the facility. 10 men, and the same address at the end of 9 of the 10 stories. Every one of them is serving a sentence with no end date, no parole mechanism, and no realistic route out, and the oldest of them has now been inside for 28 years. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.